Hello everyone, Berserkhead here, and welcome to my series called Should You Buy It, in which I buy all the DLC for Rome 2 and tell you whether if you should do the same or not. In this episode I'm going to be reviewing the Pirates and Raiders DLC, which is the newest piece of DLC at the time of recording this video. And first, let's see what the DLC adds in general. It's pretty much your typical culture pack, so as you can expect, it adds 3 new factions to the game, a new culture, new technologies, new buildings, and also a few new units. Let's start off by the new culture. So there are 4 tribes that have the Balkan culture right now. There are the Getae, which is the newest free faction added to Rome 2, and the 3 new factions added by this DLC. Now, if you ask me, these factions shouldn't be united under one culture, but the way CA did that, it kinda makes sense. So the way CA advertised that was, they said that the more factions you're at war with, the more your public order will go up, and that is actually not the case. So the way the Balkan culture works is that you're gonna be able to hire some cheap mercenaries, however you're not gonna be able to keep them for too long since the upkeep cost for all mercenary units is increased by 50%. And I like the way that works, because in this DLC you have one Illyrian faction, you have one Thracian faction, and you have one Celtic faction, so these are all culturally very different factions. However, the way the culture works, it kind of unites them under the same playstyle, which I think is a very cool idea. And in general, I don't like that CA labeled this DLC as the Pirates and Raiders DLC, because it's only the Illyrian faction that is really based on that. The other factions, at least historically speaking, they weren't really piratey and they didn't really focus on raiding that much. And there are a few other similar things that I'm gonna criticize this DLC for, but I'm gonna go into more detail about that later. And since these factions are so different from each other, let's take a look at them individually. So first of all, you have the RDIA, or the Illyrian guys, as I'm gonna call them, because their name is weird and it's kinda hard to pronounce. So they're very much a naval based faction. Their perks give them 200% income from raiding, so they're very much once again concentrated on that, and they also allow them to recruit 4 naval units per turn instead of the usual 3. And as this faction, you're gonna be concentrating on capturing cities that have ports and upgrading your ports as much as possible. Your negative perks kinda reduces the wealth that you receive from all agricultural buildings, but that's not really gonna be a problem since you can provide yourself with food by building and upgrading your ports. I think that this faction is really nice addition to the game because I really cannot think of other faction that is really dedicated on naval units. I mean, sure, there are factions that are good at naval combat, but there is not a faction that is solely based on that. And now let's take a look at the unit roster because it looks pretty good for a naval based faction. Let's just take a quick look at their naval unit roster, but unfortunately I cannot give you a viable opinion about it because my understanding of naval battles is pretty low. But when it comes to land battles, their unit roster looks pretty good as well. So when it comes to the melee infantry department, they don't really have a lot of great melee infantry, but they have some mercenaries that can do the job. But they have a lot of variety in the spear infantry department. They have a really good variety of spearmen, so you're able to choose from the cheapest units to the most expensive ones. You would expect some more Illyrian javelin men. They have the mercenary peltast unit, which is a very good unit, but I would have liked to see a non-mercenary peltast unit and also a little bit more variety. When it comes to cavalry, they have just one unit. That unit is not particularly great, but that's not something that this faction relies on. And visually, I think CA have done a decent job on these units. They don't really look like stunning or very impressive, but they look kind of normal, a little bit Greek. I'm not an expert on Illyrian culture, so I don't know how their units actually look, but I think they look decent enough. And then we move on to the Adrician Kingdom, which is my favorite faction from this DLC, and that is not because the faction is better than the other ones, but just because they're a Thracian faction, and I most likely have Thracian origin myself. So the first thing that I'm gonna criticize CA for when it comes to this faction is the faction perks. 2 of them don't make any sense whatsoever. As for the first perk, I feel like they just stuck it in there because that's the Pirates and Raiders DLC, so it would just flow well with the theme. As far as we know, they were not very warlike people. I mean, the Adrician kings were kind of expansionists, but the Thracians in general, they were not raiders, so it makes historically no sense. And then the second perk gives you diplomatic penalty with all Hellenic factions, which from a gameplay standpoint makes sense because early on you're at war with the Greek factions, so you know that provides better gameplay. However, CA always say that they're all historically accurate and they call historians or on their videos and stuff like that. But this thing I don't feel like is very historically accurate because under the Adrician kings, the Thracians were actually Hellenized. They adopted Greek language and administration, the nobles spoke Greek, they adopted the Greek alphabet, and they also adopted a lot of the Greek cultural traits and celebrations. And that's why this perk doesn't really make a lot of sense. However, I like the third one. They're very much in missile infantry based faction, so it doesn't have a great influence on the game, but it's cool to have this perk. And if we take a look at the unit roster, we will not see a great amount of units. So as you can see, the Adrician Kingdom is a faction very much based on missile infantry and melee infantry. However, I would have liked to see some extra units in these departments. For example, another melee infantry unit would have been nice, a non-mercenary Folksman unit would have been great, as well as maybe a shock cavalry unit and maybe one more unit in the missile cavalry department. And there is another thing that I'm gonna criticize CA for. This faction was in the game prior to this DLC going live, and they didn't expand on it too much. They just added a few units, but aside from that, the faction is very similar. And since it's in the game without requiring you to have this DLC, you can just download the mod that unlocks all factions and have a very similar experience. And that's a thing that I have a problem with. If you're gonna add a faction as a DLC, you'd better expand on it a little bit more. And now the last and my least favorite faction, the Tillis. You might ask why this faction is my least favorite. Well, I'm gonna tell you why. First of all, it's just a Celtic faction. And there are plenty of Celtic factions that you can play as. And if you want to have a unique Celtic faction experience, then you'd better pick the Galatians. Because they're located very far away from the other Celtic factions, such as these guys, but the Galatian faction provides better gameplay and the campaign is more interesting in general. I really don't think that this game needs another playable Celtic faction. Nothing against Celtic factions, we just have plenty of them. And another thing that I don't like about this faction, the faction perks. Okay, the first one makes sense, they're a melee infantry based faction, so that perk is very nice to have. However, look at the second one. They have Balkan culture, and at the same time they get lower public order for the presence of Balkan culture. Like, what the hell is this? Like, if you really want to put another Gallic faction in the game, put it as part of the Gallic factions. Don't make it a Balkan faction and then make it have lower public order for the presence of Balkan culture. And as for the third perk, I think that the case is very much the same as with the previous faction. They just put this perk in there because it goes well with the theme. I don't know if these guys were good raiders, I mean they're Gallic, they probably were, but that bonus is a little bit too high. As for the unit roster, they're pretty much what you would expect from a Gallic faction. They're very much focused on melee infantry and they actually have tribal warriors, which are a very nice and very cost efficient unit. Also, what's interesting about them is that they have 2 missile cavalry units, but the Galatians have them as well, so not really anything unique there. They also have a few Thracian and Gaulo-Thracian units, but aside from the tribal warriors, there is nothing that is really worth it. As for the visuals, the Thracian units look kinda different, but aside from that, they're pretty much your standard Gallic faction with a little bit of a different color scheme. And so, having said all of that, should you buy this DLC? Surprise, my answer is no for most people. Let me explain my point. I bashed on this DLC for maybe a little bit more than I should have. Truth is, I really like this DLC. However, if I gotta be honest, there is no point for you to buy this DLC unless you want to play as one of these factions specifically. Once again, if you want to play as the Tillis, you might as well pick a different Gallic faction and have pretty much the same experience. Just go pick Galatia, they're a much better faction. As for the other 2 factions, you can pick the Getae. They have the same culture, they're located on pretty much the same spot, and they have very similar units. So once again, unless you want to play as one of these units specifically, there is no point for you to buy this DLC. However, if you want to buy it, sure, go ahead, you're not gonna regret it. I just expected a little bit more out of this DLC. My biggest problem are the unit perks. They don't really make a lot of sense to me, and they could have done that better. They could have expanded the unit rosters here and there as well. And a few other things could have been tweaked and the DLC could have been much better. But maybe it's because I was just hyped for this DLC, so I expected too much. I expected it to be a different culture pack. And for the most part it is, because these factions are very different from each other. However, they don't offer anything that's not been in the game so far. The Balkan culture is nice, however, I don't really see it as a different playstyle. And once again, these factions are very nice. They look very nice, they play very nice. However, they're not just unique enough. The Adrician Kingdom's great. I'm going for a playthrough. I'm actually gonna start my own Let's Play with the Adrician Kingdom. It's probably gonna be a good time. It's a great faction. But unless you want to play specifically as the Adrician Kingdom, there is no point to buy the DLC. So this is gonna be everything from this video. I hope it was informative for you and it made up your mind on whether or not you should buy this DLC. My name is Berserkhead and I'll see you next time. Goodbye.